With unaffordable housing and stagnant incomes and a declining economy, the question today is, where is the middle class? Is it disappearing? And then, frankly, is the Canadian dream dead? Well, the economic statistics are in. There's a lot of challenges, and they're not pretty for the Canadian economy and the standard of living for the middle class. So, with me here today to talk about the issues of the middle class and the deeper things that are happening in our society is none other than Joel Kotkin. Joel is a writer, analyst. He's also a presidential appointment at Chapman University. And the New York Times describes him as America's Uber geographer. So, a warm welcome to you, Joel.
Well, great to be here.
Well, Joel, I've certainly admired for years your writings and analysis in so many contexts, whether it's the reports on housing affordability or in your columns in the National Post. But I did want to ask a basic question, Joel. And what is a Uber geographer?
Well, I don't know what got into David. That was from David Brooks. I'm not exactly sure what came into it. I think one of the things is that what David was reacting to is the fact that we don't focus on geography.
Mhm.
It's not taught in the schools anymore. And so there's this huge hole in our understanding of what's going on in society. I mean, a good case, and just so the listeners know, I'm not Canadian, but my wife is from Montreal.
Oh, great.
And so I've spent a great deal of time in Canada. Um, I think that the problem is that people have to understand that most of the media and the culture industries, if you will, are in one geography, and most of the people are in a different geography. And so
Hmm.
you end up with these tremendous differences between regions. Now, the difference may be even greater in Canada than the United States. Certainly in Quebec, where I've spent much of my time in Canada, it's very much a very different country
Hmm.
than, let's say, what I've experienced in Edmonton and Calgary, for instance.
Hmm.
So
Exactly.
geography is really critical. I mean, you can't understand what's going on in the United States today, for instance, if you don't understand the ascendancy of the South.
Indeed. Yeah, so geography does in many ways define a country. So, one of the files, public policy files, that is so important, and I wanted to begin with, is of course the work that we do together at Frontier with the Demographia Center at Chapman, is, and of course the great Wendell Cox, is the issue of housing affordability.
Yes.
And this was just released this last week, and we've got some slides to help us in this conversation. But we looked at some 95 markets around the world, including some in Canada, many in the United States, and elsewhere. Can you help us understand the bottom line that comes out of this housing affordability report?
And again, we'll go back to geography a little bit here because I think what you have is certain regions in the world and in Canada as well have decided that they are going to grow in a way that is popular with the planning community and some in the business community. I mean, the collusion between the planners and big money is not necessarily a rarity. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, basically, what you have is areas who have decided that they want to grow in a certain way. The way they want to grow is dense, urban, and to sort of stop the natural tendency of metropolitan areas, which is to grow out.
Hmm.
Historically, you grow to the more affordable areas. This is how Tokyo and London grew. Um, the problem you have in certain places is that these policies are very strict, and so what you do is you basically prevent development from going where the market would have taken it, and
Hmm.
you force a different kind of product, and you create scarcity and high land costs. So it's astounding to me that one of the most expensive cities relative to income in the world is Vancouver. Now,
It's bizarre.
it's a nice city. It's got a nice setting.
Hmm.
It's hardly New York or London or or Paris or I mean, it's just not a major world capital. I'm sorry, I'm
Hmm.
sure I'll get
No,
some hate mail,
it's true.
but and then you have Toronto. Yes, Toronto is the most important city in Canada. It would
Hmm.
be maybe the fourth or fifth most important area in the United States. Maybe, probably not even that. It's an important city. It's critical in Canada. It plays a bigger role in Canada, I think, than New York does in the United States. But it has higher prices than New York. It has higher prices than London. How does
Utterly
that work?
bizarre.
I
Yeah.
mean, and Canadians, as David, as you suggested, and that we've seen over the years, it's not like Canada is a country where the incomes are growing and, you know,
Hmm.
I mean, there seems to be a combination of the restrictions and then the decision to allow huge numbers of migrants into the country without an
Hmm.
economy to sustain them. And so,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah,
not a very pretty picture.
it's not a pretty picture. And so, in the case of housing affordability, we know it's foundational to life, particularly a vibrant middle class. So, if I just want to highlight this report here and bring up one of the slides that illustrate the situation that we're looking at, and you can find this report on Frontier's website. But it talks about these different key markets: Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Ottawa, Calgary, and Edmonton. So you can see them there. So, what does this graph explain to us, Joel?
Well, it basically just shows that those areas with the strongest urban growth boundary policies, for instance, Vancouver and Toronto being good examples,
Hmm.
tend to have the highest prices. We see the same thing in the United States. Most of the really expensive areas are in California, where these are the
Hmm.
policies as well. So,
Hmm.
and by the way, same thing's true in Australia. You know, and you can't accuse Australia or Canada of being short on land. They're
Exactly.
kind of big places with
Yeah.
relatively few people. So, basically the same things happen everywhere. I mean, Britain suffered this earlier because these policies were first put in Britain. Um,
Hmm.
but essentially, what you're doing is you're saying to people who are either Canadians born or people who have moved to Canada that the dream that existed, let's say, for my wife's family in Montreal in the 50s and 60s, that today that dream is not achievable.
Exactly. And so, I mean, the funny thing in Canada is there's a great deal of concern, rightly so, about housing affordability in these key markets. And I should note that there's many markets in Canada that the good news is that are affordable.
Yes,
But in these major markets, people are wringing their hands saying, well, how do we create more housing affordability? The government needs to start building more housing. We need to somehow do a variety of things, but they don't address the fundamental issue, which is the majority price of a house is not the house, it's the land. Is that
right.
what you're getting at, Joel?
Yes, completely. I mean, it's the land, and then you add a lot of things. One of the things is if you have a urban first, urban core first strategy, then you have to deal with urban politics. And then you
Hmm.
start getting, you know, prevailing wage. You start getting all sorts of green mandates of one kind or the other. All these things that raise prices. Plus, it tends to be very much the case, certainly in the United States, that when you try to develop in an urban area, the regulatory process becomes increasingly difficult
Hmm.
because you have all these well-organized community groups, and they're going to push their agendas.
Hmm.
Um, and then you also have neighborhoods who may want to push back. Whereas if you move into a cornfield, you're not, the corn's not going to complain that there's now houses there.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
so I think what you do is you create a situation which just raises prices. But people, unfortunately, most politicians are incredibly ignorant about, well, almost everything, but certainly uh, economics. And one of the things that they don't realize is, like, for instance, if you talk to a developer here in California where I live,
Hmm.
and they say it's going to take 5 years to get a permit. And during that time, economic conditions change. You're losing money because you're just paying the lawyers basically and the
Hmm.
lobbyists. The same time, by the time you finally get your permit, business conditions might have changed.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you end up with, I know here in California we have many more permits than we have completions because they say, oh well, we can build this, and then of course by the time you want to build it, the market for it doesn't exist. I also think
Hmm.
a lot of it has to do with the fact that the political class refuses to admit that the vast majority of people want a single family house, or
Mm.
at
Hmm.
least in a maybe more urban setting, a fairly spacious condo.
Hmm.
This is particularly true when it comes to children.
Hmm.
The chances that you'll have a family um, increases pretty dramatically if you own a house. If you don't own a house,
Hmm.
then people will say, you know what, I can't afford it, so I'm going to live in my apartment and I'm going to,
Hmm.
sit around and smoke dope and watch pornography or video
Hmm.
games or
Hmm.
social media.
Hmm.
Um, and this is the social conditions that we're encouraging because people don't see a way up, and so they just, as the Chinese would put it, lie flat. You don't, you're not
Hmm.
in, you don't work very hard. There's no goal. I mean, when you think
Right.
about it, my parents and even well, on my father's side, my grandparents, they saved and worked to buy a house. Buying a house was sort of fundamental,
Hmm.
and of course, it was good for the society because homeowners tend to be more politically involved. They tend to
Hmm.
vote. Their kids tend to do better. Um, they're involved in the local schools. They're involved in local charities. If you're a renter and maybe you're in a very small space, you're by yourself. It's a very different social environment. So you get this extremely alienated group, particularly now,
Hmm.
of young people who are well educated, who in previous generations would have been homeowners or aspiring homeowners, who are now sitting around in little one bedroom apartments.
Hmm.
If they have money, they go travel. There's a term that's being used called leisurists. They become leisurists. Their whole life is based around, when am I going on my next trip? And some
Hmm.
people, it will go to Tuscany. Some people will
Hmm.
go to the Sierra or to the mountains to go hiking. Certainly Canada, certainly certain times of the year is a great place for that.
Hmm.
And they don't focus on community, family, building personal wealth. I mean, as a father, I prioritize what's going to happen to my kids, and do I have enough to give to them so that they have a leg up when the time comes, and particularly given the
Indeed.
prices.
Hmm.
You take that away and you undermine the whole basis of a democratic society. Because, if you go back to Madison, or in particular in our country,
Hmm.
um, the idea of the United States was to be a republic of small proprietors, people who owned something, a business,
Hmm.
a house,
Hmm.
a farm. You take that away, and then you basically have two forces, which I have, worries about, I have to say. One is big government, and the other one's big capital.
Hmm.
And if there isn't this middle group that owns something and
Hmm.
has some way of pushing back against both capital and the government, you end up in a situation that is increasingly feudalistic, as I would put it.
Okay, so there you have it, the summary, in the sense that this file on housing or, frankly, property rights has a massive foundational impact on our culture from A to Z, including citizenship. And I think of, well, this is really the Canadian dream as well. We want a vibrant middle class. This is why millions have moved to Canada to
Exactly.
set up their lives so they can go forward. But it was more than that. It was also a freedom to be able to self-govern. And I think of the history, Joel, and you know this well, is going back to, frankly, Athens. where
Yes.
you had the Minos, the middle, that was neither super rich with an agenda per se or dependent on the state. They were kind of self-sufficient, and they were engaged in society. They served in the military. They served politically. So I don't mean to idealize that, but surely you're right that this issue of the declining middle class has huge implications on our democracy.
No, and you can see this throughout history. I mean, more relevant perhaps to the United States is Rome, obviously, because we are basically an empire. Whether we admit it or not, that's what we are.
Hmm.
Um, and and our Republican roots really are threatened by the loss of this property ownership. You think about Canada and its evolution. A lot of it was driven by the fact that many people, particularly in Great Britain, couldn't own property, and they realized if they moved to Canada, they might be able to get a farm
Exactly.
or
Yes.
start a business, and
Hmm.
so this whole opportunity culture, which is shaped, I would say, particularly the United States, Canada, and Australia, is now
Hmm.
under assault. And I think it's very interesting in Wendell's study that the three countries that really are screwed in this way are the United States, parts of the United States for sure, Canada, and Australia.
Crazy. So we're doing this to ourselves, Joel.
Right.
So the question I have is, what's the solution if you were maybe this isn't the best word, but if you were the prime minister in Canada for a day or the premiers, what would you do to change this? Is
Well,
there an easy
one, I
answer?
would get rid of urban containment. I would say I would be looking to open up land. Now you could preserve some farmland, you can preserve some open space,
Hmm.
um, so that it isn't all contiguous, but you have to open up the land. I mean, what happens now is you prevent land near the city from developing.
Hmm.
So what ends up being developing is super sprawl, like
Hmm.
50 miles from Toronto instead of 10 miles from Toronto or 20 miles
Hmm.
from Toronto. So that would be the first thing. Second thing is you really have to make the regulatory process less burdensome. Um,
Indeed.
I mean, in the United States, I'm not necessarily sure how it works in Canada, but in the United States, many times localities will make you pay enormous fees, sometimes 20, 30% of the cost of the house is to pay for services that in my parents' day were paid for by the state or by the
Exactly. Yeah.
locality. So you have all those infrastructure costs as well,
Hmm.
and so I mean in the state of California we have something called CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, and anybody can sue about anything, and they can hold you up for months, years,
Yeah.
sometimes
Crazy.
many years, many decades. So you have to change the regulatory structure. That is the absolute key thing. And then
Right
there are a
on.
lot of interesting innovations that we could take advantage of that would make this a, uh, uh, a much more affordable environment. One is manufactured housing.
Hmm.
That could have huge impacts on how you build things. I think that there's the movement of people working all full time or part time at home so that they can live a little further out. If you want to think about the future, I think the future is going to be, autonomous vehicles, hybrid, electric.
Hmm.
That's a discussion that's worth having. But you're going to have autonomous vehicles. You already have things like Uber and Lyft that make it possible for people to live even in the suburbs with not using their own car and maybe not having a
Hmm.
car at all. Um, we have to be looking forward to how do we build new communities and expand communities in a way that's environmentally friendly, but also that meets the needs of people. The problem of the environmental movement is that it's run by people like your prime minister who are who have estates, who live very comfortably, and everybody they know lives very comfortably,
Hmm.
and um, and they don't really care about or don't. It's not even a question of caring. I think that average Canadian or a middle class person who's working hard and trying to save to buy a house, I don't think that person exists in their mental universe. I think it's a
Mhm.
maybe some sort of abstraction. But
Mhm.
when I speak in my classes at Chapman, one of the things I ask is, I said, how many of you think you're going to buy a house in Southern California? Which, by my opinion, isn't the best geography on the planet, okay, in terms of weather and scenery
Mhm.
and all that. It's a
Mhm.
fantastic place. Not, I would say out of 35 kids, maybe five think they might. And
No
when I ask
kidding.
them, it's because they're going to get money from their parents. I
Wow.
mean,
Well, it's very discouraging because I look at it and I think, wow, if you can't have a dream of buying a home and establishing a family, moving forward as an adult, I mean that you're right. It strikes to the heart of, well, in my case, the Canadian dream.
and you think about it when we start to realize how this interfaces with, for instance, people losing themselves on social media, or
Hmm.
Mark
Hmm.
Zuckerberg's metaverse, where we're going to
Hmm.
find our friends and our experiences are all going to be digital. So we don't really care where we live. I mean, the where humanity is going. This is where I'm going in the next book. Where humanity is going is a very scary place unless we begin to realize what really matters is family, community, faith.
Hmm.
Um, can be different things, but
Hmm.
certainly, your feeling for your children, all those things, those are fundamental. And if we move away
Hmm.
from them, they're really, we're really headed towards a very nihilistic future. Um,
Well,
and I think and housing is one of the fundamental things driving this change.
okay. So this is, golly, that's a real wake up call, Joel, that you've outlined for us. Is that this housing policy file matters. It's so foundational for the structure of the rest of society here. And so, one of the related themes here, when we talk about the challenges or decline of the middle class, certainly in this country, is Canada's economic stagnation. If you
Mhm.
look at the last 10 years, I've got a slide here, I think, that illustrates this. It's quite powerful. It shows basically that you've got a whole bunch of countries here across the OECD, with Canada basically, and you follow the Canadian scene very closely, at some 1.5% of GDP growth, whereas that's in complete contrast with the United States at almost 21%. We've also got a difference in income between Canada and the United States, as an example, and this is based on purchasing power parity, so it's an apples to apples comparison, where Ontario, as one example, is some almost 40% less income than the bottom US state, Mississippi. So, what the heck has happened to this country, Canada? I mean, I can't believe this. We used to always be kind of neck and neck, a little bit behind, but 40% at the bottom state, and no offense to Mississippi, but that's pretty pathetic. What's going on, Joel?
Well, of course, you have a better sense of what's going on in Canada than I do. I can say that what I think is clearly happening is, if I may, and hopefully the listeners won't freak out, but
Okay.
Canada Canada's great asset is its natural resources. That's what makes it but one of the reasons I've always been a strong advocate of close U.S. Canada relations, because between the two of us, where we probably have the best resource base on the planet.
Yeah, no
Um,
kidding.
and certainly we have, more or less a functional legal system. So the other areas, some of them that have natural resources are, you have to deal with some pretty serious problems in Middle East or Africa. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that what I think this is one of the really scary things for Canada is you have a prime minister who's made his name in, pushing for, net zero and,
Hmm.
policies in which you can't do mining, you can't pump oil, you know essentially can't take advantage of the things where Canada has great
Hmm.
advantages.
Hmm.
I mean, Canada, like Australia, which is by the way going through the almost exact same thing. Um, Canada and Australia have relatively few people and lots of resources. That
Hmm.
should be a formula for tremendous growth and for
Absolutely.
higher incomes. And instead, you have a regime, and now in both countries, that is, basically saying, okay, we're going to cut back our production of the things that we do, and then instead we're going to buy them from other countries, or we're going to buy products from China that are made with coal that comes from Australia, and then the
Oh yeah,
Australians
that's a
end up
good
buying
point.
the cars.
No, it's almost like a black comedy, isn't it? So we're going to import stuff made from China, as an example, that's all made with coal, oil, and gas, and all the rest. I mean,
Right,
it's bizarre
and
thinking, isn't it?
it's reminds me of maybe showing my age, but the late Muhammad Ali had this thing called rope a dope,
Oh yes,
where
yeah,
like
very
you go in the
well.
ring and he would have he would have
Mhm.
the guy throw all these punches, and he would end up
Yes.
exhausting
Hmm.
himself, and then Ali would go in
That's
and
right.
knock him out. Well, that's exactly what the Chinese are doing.
But this is the curious thing, and I understand that the prime minister has his views, and we'll see how his new government unfolds. But yeah, you were adopting policies that basically are in effect shooting ourselves in the foot.
Right.
I mean, look at the largest industry in Canada is oil and gas, and that is foundational to any high functioning, prosperous society. Is affordable, dependable, reliable energy, and we've
Right.
got it in spades. And yet we're still importing energy. Last time I checked, on eastern seaboard of Canada from places like what is it again? Oh yeah, Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and all the rest. I mean, it's absurd, isn't it, Joel?
Well, you would think that Alberta could supply the and I know some of the maritime provinces also
Hmm.
have oil. So, but if you're
Yeah,
going to decide that oil is the energy version of demon rum, um,
exactly.
and you're going to treat it as
Yes.
it's sinful
Hmm.
to even think about using it.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. Then it makes, yeah, it's really interesting. And the irony on top of that, Joel, is because Canada only has one primary customer, namely the United States, we are a price taker, not a price maker in the world market. So it's a dynamic number, but we basically kind of get ripped off by about 20%. And it basically costs Canada, as we export this oil and gas, approximately $30 billion at least every year. In fact, at Frontier last month, we released a economic counter that documents minute by minute the amount of money we're forfeiting. So, we obviously, as a country, can't build the pipelines to Tidewater to get to world markets because we've got delegation after delegation, the Japanese, the Germans, the Greeks. I mean, there's just a myriad of them that want our energy, and we can't get it done because we're hamstrung by red tape and this war, this ideological war on oil and gas.
Right. And it's I mean, the good thing for our country, of course, is that even though we're the largest oil and gas producer now, um, we have a huge amount of a huge market for it domestically, and also we have parts of the country where we where they've been welcomed. I mean, as I understand it, one of the problems Canada has with its gas is oil and gas in the West can't has no outlet at the Pacific.
That's it.
Our
Yes.
oil and now we have that situation now in California, but which used to have a huge oil industry. But part of the problem is that if you have states like Louisiana and Texas who are more than happy to build giant LNG export facilities
Hmm.
and are doing so. Canada could do that too. I mean, you could certainly,
Absolutely. Yeah.
you don't have to do Vancouver. You could do Prince Rupert. You could do
Yeah.
some
Absolutely.
other part. And the question really is, and I think this goes back to feudalism, which is still a big concern, which is you now have a small elite in Canada and America
Hmm.
in the financial service industry, in the dominant companies, many of the
Hmm.
dominant companies, but particularly on Wall Street. And you know what? They they don't care about these things as long as they're making money, and they make
Hmm.
money without necessarily depending on cheap energy.
Hmm.
They're going to keep doing it. Now, what's going to be
Yeah.
very interesting in the future and may eventually change the political dynamic here is if Canada wants to compete in the world of AI and
Hmm.
all the tremendous demands on energy that are going to result from AI, machine learning. I mean, all these things that are now coming
Hmm.
down the pike. What's Canada going to do? If Canada has expensive
Exactly.
energy, why would
Hmm.
I put a server farm there? I mean, you've got
Exactly.
states like Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
and states like Texas who are going to leverage their energy
Hmm.
to attract companies that need the power to power AI, machine learning,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
and all the various different things that the digital age has opened up. So I think it's very short-sighted because what we're seeing, what's very interesting to me, is you have companies now like Google who are basically admitting that they're using more energy than they did before, and they're pushing nuclear power. Some of them
Hmm.
are pushing
Hmm.
natural gas. Um, and if Canada um, fumbles this football, if you
Hmm.
will, um, you're going to end up in a situation where not only are you hurting the oil rigger who's probably in the mind of the Toronto elite is some
Hmm.
racist horrible
Hmm.
person, though he's probably an immigrant, and
Hmm.
or very likely an immigrant. Certainly that's true in America as well.
Hmm.
Or somebody from the working class. If it's not just him, it's going to affect your tech economy in
Indeed.
uh,
Yeah.
in Toronto and Montreal.
That's right.
Otherwise we're just sort of we have is a ruling elite that really is what you might say, as I'm sure Justin Trudeau would say, is post-national. Doesn't really give a
Hmm.
damn what happens to
Hmm.
Canada.
Hmm.
They give a damn what happens to them and to their
Right.
friends, and then
Hmm.
their sense of the global picture. But the
Hmm.
but the the interest of somebody living in the suburbs of Toronto, I don't think that's particularly important to them.
Exactly. So this is a theme I want to pick up a little bit more and help us understand what we mean by neo-feudalism in the sense that
Okay,
we know that's a term from, well, the medieval era where you had a very hierarchical society. So give us the basics of understanding what you
sure.
mean by neo-feudalism, Joel.
All right. Well, I'll start, and and I'll start with the respect of my wife's French origins.
Yes.
Uh, Her mother is from Paris, actually.
Hmm.
Um, but the society of the what they call ancien regime. There
Hmm.
were three classes. There was the clergy,
Hmm.
the aristocracy, and everyone else.
Hmm.
Well, now what we have is we don't. The clergy is kind of powerless at this stage, or reasonably powerless. It's been supported by what I call the clerisy, which is the universities, the academics,
Hmm.
the whole professional class, which has become the basis of left of center parties all over the world now.
Hmm.
It's the basis of the Labor Party. It's the basis of the of the Labour Party in Australia. It's the basis of the Liberal Party in Canada, and it's the basis of the Democratic Party in the United
So,
States.
so this is the class, and I say this tongue in cheek, that are the good and the great. They know what's good for the rest of us.
Exactly, and they tend to see themselves as sort of the people who really should be running things. I mean, again, very much
Yeah.
like the medieval clergy,
Hmm.
um, and the medieval clergy obviously did some very good things, but also a lot of very bad things. But they were a
Hmm.
very strong, powerful group. So this is one class. The
Hmm.
aristocracy, obviously, we don't have the old aristocracy. What we have is this aristocracy of wealth that's particularly Wall Street and the tech oligarchs. We have to
Hmm.
remember something very scary. Companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Apple have GDPs, if you will, greater than most countries,
Hmm.
including
It's
Canada.
remarkable.
I
Yeah,
mean,
including Canada.
to me, it is terrifying that somebody's worth 2 to 300 billion dollars.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
even a guy who's done some great things like Elon Musk, particularly with space. Um,
Hmm.
is it healthy for society to have people worth two, three
Hmm.
hundred billion dollars who can?
Hmm.
I mean, when you think about in the United States, the far left in the United States is funded by a handful of oligarchs.
Hmm.
Soros.
Hmm.
There's a bunch of them, or
Yeah.
the inheritors of wealth.
Right.
Um,
Or ironically, as we've seen in the revelations from the accounts of who USAID is funding, let alone the so-called green slush funds in Canada, it's the state that's funding a number of these activist groups as well, is it not, Joel?
Right. Well, and of course, and then they have the ability because they've got the lobbyists, because they've got the connections, and because these people
Hmm.
go from one thing to another. I mean,
Hmm. Yeah.
they may be working in this ministry, and then they go to a
Hmm.
nonprofit, and then a nonprofit
Right.
gets money from the ministry,
Yeah.
and then maybe they go back to the ministry. I mean, this is sort of the second. Then I now divide the rest of us into two groups. Um, One would be what you would call the yeomanry, and they're the class under assault. Small business, independent, family-owned
Hmm.
companies, homeowners. Um, this is the group that is really being had been ascendant through most of the last 100 years and is now
Hmm.
in decline in significant
Hmm.
ways.
Hmm.
And then you have below this a growing class with that I define as serfs, which are
Hmm.
people at the bottom who will never own a house, can barely make it, are increasingly, as Marx suggested, sort of a capitalist alms system. And you now have it's not hard to understand that if you're a oligarch, maybe you say, well, maybe we'll have a basic income. So what we can do is we can keep the proles from getting too out of control. We'll pay them
Hmm.
$2,000 a month, and we'll subsidize their rent, and that will become a huge part of your population. So increasingly, the children of the yeomen are becoming serfs because they're never going to own a home. They're
Wow.
probably not going to be able to start a business. Now, again, in America, and again, I'm not sure where we are with in Canada exactly, but in America, what you have increasingly is downward mobility,
Hmm.
and we can project that that's going to happen as housing becomes more expensive, as regulation becomes harder, as it becomes more difficult to build a small industrial
Hmm.
company. Um,
Indeed.
I think what you're going to find is a diminishing of this yeoman class, which is the basis of
Hmm.
the democracy,
Hmm.
and its replacement by a serf class, which will be essentially dependent on the state.
Okay, so you have kind of an inversion of the Canadian/American dream here, where the belief was that somehow working hard, getting one's education, you could get a foothold in upward mobility. You could climb the ladder.
Right.
And I've seen this. We've all seen it. But in fact, there's the Gini coefficient. Um, mathematically measures this, and that is changing, and so that mobility, a marker then of this emerging feudalism, as you say, is the lack of mobility. In fact, people are going down the ladder instead of up the ladder. Is that
Right.
right, Joel?
Right. And I think, great disservice is being done by, frankly, by libertarians who say, well, it's not so bad because of the transfer payments make up for some of this inequality. Well, yeah, but somebody who's getting transfer payments is a very different person than the person who goes out and has a job in the private sector.
Hmm.
One person is a dependent and one person is independent. I mean, I'm
Exactly. Yeah.
more interested in the, if you will, the political economy, which is if you have
Hmm.
a political economy where the vast majority of people are essentially or dependent on government transfers, that that can't be a democratic society
No.
ultimately.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the
Exactly.
things I like to say to my conservative friends is many times they're supporting policies that destroy the middle class. And then by destroying the middle class, you essentially destroy conservatism.
Okay,
Homeowners
but
are,
let's just pause here for a sec, because Joel, I think that's an incredibly important headline. And you're saying that because if you're totally dependent on the state, you're going to just keep voting for more state goodies. Is
why
that
not?
right?
I mean,
Yeah.
if I know I'm never going to own a house, why wouldn't I vote for Bernie Sanders? Why wouldn't I vote for,
Hmm.
somebody who says, "Oh, we'll have rent control for
Hmm.
everyone," or
Hmm.
um, or we're gonna give you, $2,000 a month, even if you don't work.
Right
Um,
on. Well, and I would say from a larger, frankly, policy and even a moral perspective, what kind of vision for society is that we're just dependent on the state when we should be saying, surely you want autonomy and the ability to go forward as an adult so you can be the best you can be as a human being and contribute to society. I mean, this is kind of absurd, isn't it? The point that
well,
we've
I think it
reached.
has to do with the arrogance of the clerisy and the oligarchy who feel that actually you can't really do very much. You're not really important. We're going to replace you with AI, or
Yeah,
we're we're going to make it so that when you come out of college, you have no real skills anyway.
exactly.
Um, and so
But
so I
see,
think
on that front, Joel, then isn't that again an inversion? Again, not of we flipped the economy where people can't get social mobility because their economic future is limited. But it's changing the whole culture where we used to think that, at least in Canada, we believe that people are equal. There's a
right.
respect for individual rights and freedoms. And now we have this kind of overclass that thinks they're the good and the great. They're the aristocrats, the royalty that are entitled to live off of everybody else.
And they're also able to say, and we're going to do things like we're going to have racial quotas, or
Oh, yeah. Yes.
we're going to decide, well, here are the groups that are really have historically, to be blunt, the people we've exploited, we're going to put above everyone else,
Hmm.
and we're going to have all sorts of we have the DEI thing here. I know in Canada you've had
Oh, it's
many of the
huge.
same
Huge. Yeah.
things,
Yes.
where the first question that gets asked is not who the scholar is or who the writer is,
Hmm.
but what's their ethnicity, what's their
Hmm.
sexual orientation,
Yeah.
um, and for
Well,
society,
well, well, Joel, in Canada right now, every federal grant, I believe, and most provincial ones, if you're hiring somebody in a university or post-secondary, is all beginning with the premise of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's
right?
the number one issue at the top. So that means you've left your ability to really work at merit and generation of knowledge. You've put the ideology, the orthodoxy, and I think you allude to this as you talk about feudalism. It's this rigid, almost secular religion that's taken over and superseded the whole principle of merit.
Well, and I think, and that will be a long term problem for our society, and in Canada's case as well, because ultimately you're not going to be very competitive in that kind of situation. It's
Hmm.
um, and many bad things happen in China, but I don't think that engineers are minted based on their race or their. I mean, obviously,
Hmm.
because race is not so much an issue in China since it's overwhelmingly one race. Um, but or from India, they still have a merit-based
Hmm.
situation, particularly in the sciences. Um, if we start getting to the point where our doctors are being determined by their ethnicity and by their family backgrounds, we're in serious trouble. I mean, you
Okay,
know,
but Joel, I'm sorry to tell you, in almost every medical school now in Canada, the admission standard begins with a DEI questionnaire in terms of your political belief system and how you think. And this is disturbing. I don't know about you, I want the best physician. I don't care what you think. I want you to be the best physician, the best pilot, the best whatever, instead of whether you think politically correct or not.
no, I agree, and I'll tell you one of my good friends who's Hispanic. He's a astrophysicist with many patents and is building, robots. I mean, doing all sorts of amazing stuff.
Hmm.
He says the most insulting thing ever to him is when they say, "Oh, you're on the board of this company
Yeah.
because you're Hispanic." No, the guy is kind of a genius and
Wow.
has
Isn't
done
that
all
enough?
these things. He says, I'm a scientist, an engineer.
Hmm.
That's what I am. And I think this notion that we're going to, and then it starts to become really absurd when you start getting into the gender issues and then sexual
Hmm.
orientation. I don't
Hmm.
really care how my doctor gets his sexual gratification. I just want to make sure my
Hmm.
doctor is a good doctor and knows what he's doing.
I'm with you. So,
Everything else
so,
is irrelevant.
so in this world of neo-feudalism, as you call it, there's the emergence really of a kind of a new religion, a kind of a
Yes,
secular religion based on this kind of fetishization of victimhood. My friend Eric Kaufman talks a lot about cultural socialism.
right.
So in this environment, we've given up on the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. I can hear his speech ringing clearly in my ears that we should be judged not on the basis of our skin color, but based on our character. That's long gone now.
Yeah, well, the religion has two major parts to it. One is this sort of gender, race, ethnicity, settler,
Hmm.
colonial, that thing,
Hmm.
and the other part of it is the greens, the net
Ah,
zero. Those
right.
are the
Climate
two
alarmism. Yeah.
pillars of this religion, and both of them work against essentially this advance of society. It instead of saying, "Hey, we can get to these goals in ways that don't destroy our our economy," uh, tell me, how is it an environmental win that we replace oil drilled in Canada with oil drilled in Venezuela? I
Hmm.
think the environmental controls are going to be a little bit better in Canada. Um, where do I
Agreed.
want
Yeah.
my oil refined? I want it refined in a place where things are done in a certain way. Look, what the climate stuff and this other pillar, this sort of gender, race, um, sexual orientation, is these are two things that make it very difficult for middle class people to advance, and it undermines, I think, the essential nature of a liberal society, because you're basically
Hmm.
judging people by their backgrounds, by
Hmm.
but you're judging people by their political views. I
Yeah,
mean, I think about this
exactly.
whole business now where, like in the state of California, they were trying to block Elon Musk from shooting satellites into space from Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is
Seriously.
one of the premier launch sites in
Yes.
in, in the world.
Hmm.
because they don't like his politics. I mean, what?
Oh, for Pete's sake. Yeah.
I mean,
No,
yes.
it's unbelievable. So when we look then also at this emergence of, well, neo-feudalism, help us explain the relationship to globalism. And I think just this past week, we've seen the adoption by the World Health Organization by, I believe it was 124 nations, including Canada, to adopt the pandemic treaty. I think it's about a 30-page document. You should read it. It's quite an eye-opener. It is binding in terms of how we respond to these things. And I'm not saying that we don't work together internationally, of course, but to give your sovereignty over to an organization like the World Health Organization, I have huge problems in terms of how that operated or didn't under the COVID-19 issues. But it's fascinating. There are many countries that did not sign the document, beginning with what's it called again? Oh, yeah, the United States, Russia, India, China, among
Well, these
many
aren't
others.
important countries.
No, these are not important countries. So why is there a relationship between this whole notion that we've got the groups from these international bodies like the United Nations or Davos or the World Economic Forum, and I know it's complex, but that frankly work together as these kind of aristocratic elites who kind of say, well, democracy really is not for us, so we'll do the big workaround at the global level. Is that what's going on here with
Well, I think
this
that's a
new
big
feudal elite?
that I think that's a big part of it. I mean, I think that there's the people can't be trusted, and legislatures can't be trusted. I mean, when you think about it, in this country,
Legislatures.
legislatures, in other words, the elected representatives are not, really shouldn't make these policies. I mean, you think about many of the policies that have been passed, let's say on, environment, like I would say EV mandates. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
times they come from from the inside the bureaucracy. You'd never get an EV mandate through the Senate. I mean, they've just moved against even the California exceptions on EVs. So what you have is you have increasingly power more in the control of, if you go back to Brave New World, to the controllers, to the
Right.
people at
Mm-hmm.
the very top, and they can
Mm-hmm.
say, hey, our goal is a green, wonderful planet where everybody does well, but we're going to make that determination from on high. And the international bodies are a great source of this. I mean, to me, it's absurd that the WHO was saying anything about pandemics, given their complete screw up during the COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
you have a United Nations where what the Human Rights Commission has, like, countries like Iran and North Korea. I mean, what does
Mm-hmm.
this mean? I mean, frankly, I think
Exactly.
I think we would be better off. I don't even know why we want the United Nations to stay in the United States, because you know the real estate have better use to do something useful. Um, and so I think that what you get is you get this sort of globalized economy. And of course, in economic terms, what's happening is the Chinese say, okay, yeah, we'll be part of this globalized economy,
Mm-hmm.
but we're not. We're going to do it our way, and our way is
Exactly.
the state will decide what happens and what doesn't happen, and who has,
Mm-hmm.
who builds and who doesn't build. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very uh, you know theoretically, neoliberalism worked, and I think up until the 80s or 90s it was kind of working. And because
Mm-hmm.
the country that was most disruptive at that time was Japan, and Japan was
Mm-hmm.
not a military threat, and eventually the Japanese backed down on a lot of issues. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the biggest concern. But you now have in China a power that is prodigious and has a great history,
Mm-hmm.
high level of innovation, um, and a lot of discipline. And that can't work if you allow that power to be a dominant power in a, in quote, free trading system. It's like sort of saying, well, you know what, we're going to have a crime free society, run by the mafia. I mean, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's insane. But this is where we're gone. And the people at the top are going to be fine with this. You know,
Hmm.
nobody nobody who comes from the upper classes, goes to Harvard Business School, and works on Wall Street is going to lose their job in the near future to Chinese. But
Hmm.
the factory worker might, the Canadian oil rigger might, if you allowed the Chinese into Canada with EVs, you'd have no car industry at all. If you have an EV
Hmm.
mandate and the
Hmm.
Chinese are producing all the cheap EVs, you know what's going to
Wow.
happen. I mean,
So
so the
so
bottom
but
line
this
is
is.
this sort of globalist perspective may have been a good thing up to a certain point, but
Mhm.
now all the Western countries face, in many ways, diminishing economies, diminishing wealth, less opportunity. Um, so I think that we really have to think about doing things in a little bit different way. That continuing the way we've been continuing leads us to a feudal future in which the West is eventually overcome, predominantly by China, eventually by India.
Okay, so that's quite the reality therapy we're getting here today, Joel, as we think about how do we renew our society and rebuild the middle class, get our economy moving, but more than that, renew our culture and our democratic institutions. So, if you look at this situation, I guess I'm struck by the whole notion then that there's new meaning to the phrase that you've heard in many different globalist circles, like "you will own nothing, but you'll be happy."
Oh yeah,
Is that kind of what they're getting at? Is that they'll own lots, but the rest of us won't really own much, but we will
right.
be happy as we kind of live in our own virtual metaverse, courtesy of Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, but I think that that's kind of where we're headed. I think that there's uh, this idea that against home ownership. I mean, this is one of the things where I think we touched on briefly, where
Hmm.
libertarians are saying, "Oh, home ownership isn't important.
Hmm.
We should have no zoning at all, and let Blackstone uh, and the large investment banks in the city of London or
Hmm.
in Wall Street, let them buy all the homes and let everybody be a renter."
Yeah,
And
crazy.
I said, "What do you think is going to happen? Do you
Hmm.
think that
Right.
that by undermining the middle class in your worship of market fundamentalism, you end up destroying your own politics? Because
Exactly. Yeah.
conservatism can only do well if there's a large class of small proprietors."
Right on. So I want to turn now, like we've had a very far reaching conversation, Joel. It's been fascinating. I want to turn to the role of the citizen. What can we do, given all of the above, to start bringing some common sense and some reality to this? Because it seems like we've got a major set of challenges, and you could just throw up your hands and say, well, there's nothing we can do. I don't believe that. What do you think? What can we do?
Well, I think the first thing is, that old, I know it's in the New Testament, physician, heal thyself.
Indeed. Yes.
I mean, the key thing is you have to start looking at yourself. Like, what do I do?
Mm.
Am I raising kids? Am I involved in my community? Um,
Hmm.
I think a key issue, and I think Canadians should be receptive to this given their history, decentralization. Let power proceed. I remember when I was a kid in the 1965 New York City race, and Norman Mailer and Jimmy Breslin were running. And I mean, one of the things that they said is, look, if Harlem wants to make Malcolm X's birthday a holiday, that's okay. And if Staten
Hmm.
Island wants to make John Birch's birthday a holiday, that's okay. So I think the idea is, look, if the people of Greater Toronto want to have incredibly high energy prices and incredibly high housing prices, and they want to teach transgenderism in their schools, and they want,
Hmm.
you know, burly men to be playing field hockey with the girls. That's their choice.
Yeah.
But you know what? That's not going to make it in Manitoba. It's not going to make it in Alberta. It's not going to
Hmm.
make it in
Hmm.
Saskatchewan. It's probably not
Hmm.
going to make it in a lot of the Toronto suburbs. It
Right.
may not even make it. It certainly, some of it wouldn't even make it in the immigrant
Hmm.
communities for sure.
Hmm.
But I think you have to see, how do we move power down close to where people
Exactly.
are? I don't think, like, some some ways, like, you know I'm sympathetic to some of the things that Trump people are doing on DEI, but why don't we do this at the local level? And if
Right.
you want, if Harvard wants to can stay a DEI place, you know what?
Hmm.
In 30 years, Vanderbilt University and the University of Texas, where I'm a fellow, will be in much better shape than Harvard.
Hmm. Hmm.
Be-
But in this context, so I think you're getting at something. I mean, at Frontier, we would promote those policies of, well, transparency, accountability, but subsidiarity. Move the power to the people through school vouchers, as an example. We don't need a cookie cutter approach of public education. We need innovation and accountability and transparency. So give the power to the parent where it belongs. Is that a good example?
Yeah, that's a great. I mean, we have the absurd situation here in California where a parent could be sanctioned for objecting to unauthorized, transsexual transition of their 10-year-old.
For Pete's
Okay,
sake.
what? I mean, look, if I had a child, which fortunately I don't have a child with this issue, but I would want that decision to be mine. And when they're young, that decision is mine.
Hmm.
It shouldn't be the
Hmm.
school board's choice. Um,
Right.
and if a parent says, "Okay, I think this is what my child wants, and I think it's best for them," then that's fine. But I think that we have to put power back to communities, to families, to uh, to people who are closest to it. I mean, I've noticed, for instance, in work I've done here in Southern California, city of Los Angeles, big government, completely dysfunctional. Uh, but you go to some of these little towns, and they're doing great because everybody knows
Indeed.
the mayor. You know, people live
Exactly.
in this environment. Like as one, and some of these are predominantly Latino cities. The mayor will say, "Well, if there's graffiti, if I go to the coffee shop, people start yelling at me. So of
Hmm.
course, the graffiti goes down the next
Exactly.
day."
Well, Joel, I was a former mayor, and believe me, it's a wonderful environment when you can talk with citizens every day and they can tell you exactly what they think. And I think that's just great accountability. So we should be empowering local government instead of having well, in this case in Canada, having a federal government constantly get out of its constitutional lane and interfering with provincial and local matters. That's a big problem.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, one of the great advantages that Canada has had historically is that the provinces had quite a bit of leeway to do what they wanted to
Indeed.
do. And
Indeed, they were they're the most powerful level of government in many respects. So, as we wrap up our conversation today, Joel, I want to thank you so much for your insights on what's happening, not only in terms of affordability, but frankly, the deeper issues that are happening structurally to our society. And so, I guess, where do you see signs of hope as we look to the year 2025?
well, one thing is, I do think that there
Hmm.
is some reaction to the sort of progressive overreach. I think that's
Hmm.
happening. So I think overall in the long term demographic issue, I think that there's hope that this will be recovered. I think also people are beginning to start to look at going back to church. Um, so I think that there are signs. When something is done to excess, there tends to be a reaction to it, and I think we're seeing the beginning of that. And I also think that there are examples of successful cities, successful communities, and that they will eventually attract more people, and they will attract more businesses. So, I do think that there are signs of some hope. I don't think we're going to see many signs of hope at the elite university level or in the elite bureaucracies or among
Hmm.
the oligarchs. I don't think that's where we're going to see the change. But I think the changes are happening. I think things that work will tend to gain more adherence than things that don't.
Well said. Well, thank you so much, my friend Joel Kotkin, for joining us today for this far reaching conversation about the Canadian and even the American dream as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.